In the small, peaceful neighborhood of Riverbend, the sun peeked over the horizon as a gentle breeze stirred the trees. The soft light cast long shadows across the front yard of Sam Williams, a 99-year-old retired Army veteran. Sam's steps were slow and measured as he walked across the cracked concrete pathway leading to his front door. His weathered hands grasped a cane, not out of necessity, but because his daughter, Tina, insisted he use it after a minor fall 2 winters ago. Sam had lived in this house since the late 1940s, having bought it with his late wife, Clarissa, when they started their family. Each morning, rain or shine, Sam followed the same routine. First came the raising of the flag, a private ritual he had practiced since his time in the Army. With the discipline of a soldier, Sam would hoist the stars and stripes high above his front porch, as a silent tribute to the comrades he lost during World War II. His neighbors had grown used to seeing him in his favorite light blue cardigan, beige trousers, and perfectly polished black shoes, shined every Sunday evening in memory of those days when military precision was a part of his daily life. As Sam stood by the flagpole, lifting it with practiced hands, he smiled as a familiar voice called out from the sidewalk. "Morning, Mr. Williams." It was Emily, the young girl from 2 houses down, riding her bicycle past his home. "Good morning, Emily," Sam replied with a wave. He had known her since she was a toddler, and although he had no grandchildren of his own, Emily and the other children in the neighborhood had filled that role. They often called him Grandpa Sam, even though Tina and her husband had never been able to have children. After a quick exchange, Sam made his way to his garden, where the roses Clarissa had planted years ago needed tending. Gardening was his refuge, the one thing that gave him peace ever since his wife passed away 4 years ago. The roses, delicate yet strong, reminded him of the love they shared and the life they'd built together. As he trimmed away the old, withered branches, Sam's thoughts drifted back to his days in the Army, when he was just 18 and stationed in Europe. He had seen his share of battles, but it was in a small, war-torn village that he had first discovered his love for tending to plants. During the quiet moments between skirmishes, Sam and his fellow soldiers had helped the villagers care for their small vegetable gardens, and Sam realized that life could bloom even in the harshest conditions. It was this lesson that had stayed with him all these years. Even now, with the world changing around him, the simple act of caring for his roses kept him grounded. Just as he was about to reach for the watering can, the peaceful silence of the morning was shattered by the unmistakable rumble of motorcycle engines. Sam's head snapped up. The sound grew louder, vibrating through his bones, until it shook the glass of his kitchen window. He turned to see a group of motorcycles tearing down the street, their riders wearing black leather vests adorned with an ominous red snake emblem. They circled the street once before pulling into the vacant warehouse across from Sam's house. The warehouse had been empty for years, ever since the local furniture factory closed down, but now it looked like it had been claimed. More motorcycles arrived, and soon there were at least 20 of them. The bikers began to unload their gear and set up camp, their loud music and rowdy laughter filling the air. Sam's peaceful morning was over. You won't believe what happened next, and I promise, no one saw this coming. A 99-year-old man, yes, you heard that right, was about to turn the tables on a group of bikers who had been terrorizing his neighborhood for days. But how? Where are you watching from? Have you ever witnessed something like this? If it were you, what would you do? Please comment publicly in the comment line below. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories tomorrow. That's it. You wouldn't believe it, but it was only the beginning. The next morning, things escalated, and Sam was faced with a decision that would change everything. The next day, the neighborhood was on edge. The bikers, now calling themselves the Red Snakes, had taken over the old warehouse. They were loud, they were rude, and worse, they had no respect for anyone or anything. It wasn't the first time that motorcycles had passed through the street, but something about these riders felt different. Their reckless behavior was starting to affect everyone. People began to stay inside, windows were closed, and the children who once played outside now kept to their homes. Sam sat in his favorite armchair, gazing out the window, a cup of coffee in his hands. He couldn't ignore the fact that these bikers weren't just passing through. They were here to stay. As the days passed, Their antics grew more brazen. They would ride across Sam's lawn, leaving deep tire tracks in the grass, and sometimes they would even throw empty bottles at his house, laughing as they did. It wasn't just the damage they caused, it was the intimidation. They would circle the block, slowing down just enough to shout insults at Sam as they passed. One day, one of the bikers even kicked over his mailbox. "Hey, old man, you don't own this street," one of them yelled, revving his engine. Sam stood up from his chair, his grip tight on his cane. His heart raced, not out of fear, but out of a deep, simmering anger. He had fought in wars, real wars, when his life was on the line. And now, at 99, these punks thought they could intimidate him? No, Sam wasn't going to back down. That night, Sam sat in his living room, staring at the photos of his fallen comrades hanging on the wall. His mind raced with thoughts of how to handle the situation. He couldn't just call the police. He had already done that, and they had done nothing. The bikers knew they could get away with it, and so far, they had. But Sam knew something these bikers didn't. He had a brotherhood of his own, and it was time to call in a favor. You won't believe who Sam called. It wasn't the police. It wasn't a lawyer. It was something far more powerful. The next morning, Sam did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out his old Army service ID, the one that had seen him through countless battles. He dialed the number he had kept hidden for decades, his contact with the Veterans Motorcycle Alliance, VMA, a network of bikers who had served in the military. "Sam Williams," the voice on the other end answered. "What's going on?" "I need your help," Sam said, his voice steady, despite the tension building in his chest. And just like that, help was on the way. The following day, as the bikers roared down the street, they were met by a completely different kind of biker. Not the loud, brash red snakes, but a line of polished, military-grade motorcycles, each one decorated with military insignia, flags, and patches from all branches of the armed forces. The red snakes quickly realized they were in trouble when the first wave of veterans rolled up. More and more arrived, until the entire street was filled with motorcycles. There was no shouting, no revving of engines, just an imposing presence, one that made the red snakes back down. It wasn't just about the bikes, it was about the message they sent. The veterans formed a tight circle around the warehouse, their faces grim but resolute. They didn't need to say a word. Their presence spoke for itself. As the leader of the red snakes, Snake, stepped out of the warehouse to confront them, he was met by Iron Lady, a formidable woman in combat boots and a leather jacket, who stepped forward with a cold, unflinching stare. "Here's the deal," she said. "This is Sam's neighborhood, and you've disrespected it. You've disrespected us, and we don't take kindly to that." The bikers could see that they were outnumbered, outclassed, and out of their depth. What followed was a confrontation unlike anything they had ever experienced before. They didn't just back down. They were made to pay for their actions. By the end of the day, the red snakes had cleaned up every trace of their destruction. They had mended the fences, repaired the garden, and scrubbed off the graffiti they had sprayed on Sam's garage. They had no choice. The veterans had made it clear. You either clean up or face the consequences. Sam watched from his porch, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The bikers had learned the hard way that respect couldn't be bought. It had to be earned. The neighborhood, once a place of fear, had been restored to its former peace. And Sam Williams, the 99-year-old war hero, had reminded everyone that courage, honor, and brotherhood were timeless values that could never be taken away. As the sun set over Riverbend, Sam raised the flag one last time. But this time, he wasn't alone. The days following the confrontation were quieter, but not in the way one might expect. The red snakes had retreated, yes, but their presence lingered in the memories of those who had witnessed what had happened. People started to talk. Whispers spread like wildfire through Riverbend. The legend of Sam Williams, the 99-year-old veteran who took a stand against a gang of bikers, was now a tale woven into the fabric of the neighborhood. Sam wasn't just an old man anymore. He was a hero, though he would never admit it. Every day after the bikers left, Sam continued his quiet routine. He tended to his roses, sat in his armchair by the window, and waited for Tina, his daughter, to visit. The phone calls from his fellow veterans, from his old army buddies, started to come in more frequently. They'd heard about the standoff, and they wanted to know how Sam was doing. They were proud of him, but they knew it wasn't just about the bikers. It was about something deeper, something that Sam had always believed in, even as a young soldier. Honor, dignity, the belief that no one, no matter how young or old, should have to live in fear. On one of these visits, Tina sat across from her father, sipping coffee as she looked at the quiet street. "Dad, you're getting a lot of attention," she said softly, as if unsure how to approach the topic. "People are calling you a hero. The news stations have reached out." Sam chuckled, his deep voice rumbling in a way that made the sound of it feel more like a memory than a present reality. "Hero? Tina, I've done my share of fighting in my day, but that's behind me now. I'm just an old man trying to live out my days in peace." But Tina could see the pride in his eyes, the quiet strength that came from knowing he'd done what was right, not because he had to, but because he couldn't stand idly by. "I know, Dad," she said, "but what you did, you showed them, and you showed me, too. You're not just sitting back. You're living with purpose. You've taught me so much, even when I didn't realize it." That was when Sam realized something. He wasn't done yet. His purpose wasn't just to sit in a chair and wait for life to pass by. It was to continue being the person who stood up for what was right, to be the example of resilience, integrity, and strength. Weeks passed, and the biker gang never returned. The neighborhood had settled back into its usual rhythm, but Sam wasn't content to rest on his laurels. One afternoon, as he walked down to the local grocery store, he noticed a group of children playing near the park. They waved at him as they always did, but today, there was something different about the way they looked at him. It was more than just a casual greeting. It was admiration. A small group of parents was standing nearby, talking quietly. One of them, a father named Mark, who had lived in Riverbend for years, approached Sam with a hesitant smile. "Sam, can we talk for a minute?" Sam paused, looking Mark in the eyes. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Mark looked around at the other parents before speaking. "We've been talking, and well, after what happened with the bikers, we realized something. You've been an example to all of us, an example of what it means to stand up, no matter the odds. And we want to make sure the kids here, the ones who grew up seeing that, remember it." Sam's brow furrowed, but Mark continued. "We want to dedicate a park bench in your honor, Sam, for your service and for showing us all what real courage looks like. We want the kids to have something to remember, something to know that standing up for what's right, well, that doesn't have an expiration date." Sam was speechless for a moment. The idea of a bench in his honor seemed so simple, so humble, but it was everything he had fought for. It was a symbol of everything he believed in. "That's a generous thought, Mark, but I don't need any kind of monument," Sam said, his voice gruff. "I just want people to remember to take care of one another." Mark smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "We think it's the right way to do it. Will you accept?" Sam's eyes softened as he gazed out over the park where the children played. He thought about all the faces he had seen over the years, the faces of his comrades, and the faces of the families he had fought to protect. Finally, with a small, yet proud smile, Sam nodded. "All right, but make sure that bench is facing the playground. Let the kids play, and let them know that if they stand up for each other, they're already stronger than they think." The dedication ceremony took place 2 weeks later, and on a crisp autumn day, the entire neighborhood gathered in the park. A plaque was mounted on the bench, in honor of Samuel "Sam" Williams, a true American hero. May his strength and courage inspire us all. As the sun set that evening, the families lingered, some playing in the park, some just sitting and talking. Sam sat on the bench, looking at the people he had come to love in this small, tight-knit community. He was no longer just an old man with a cane. He was the heart of Riverbend, a man who had fought for his country, for his family, and for the people around him. And now, his legacy was living on, not in stories, but in the daily lives of the people he had protected and inspired. And as the last of the bikers' taunts faded into memory, Sam leaned back on the bench, knowing that his work was done. But there was one final thing he wanted to do, one more piece of unfinished business. He stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. "I think it's time for one last ride." It wasn't what you'd expect. No roaring engine, No leather jacket, no fearsome display of power. Instead, it was a quiet, reflective moment. Sam donned his old army uniform, still crisp, still well-kept, and sat on his motorcycle, which he had carefully restored over the years. It was no longer just a vehicle. It was a symbol of his journey. With a slow kick of the starter, Sam rode off down the road, waving to those who still remembered him, and with each turn of the wheel, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His fight, though long over, would always remain in the hearts of those who knew the true meaning of courage. And as Sam rode, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving only the sound of the wind and the hum of the engine behind. Sam's ride wasn't a simple return to the past. It was an affirmation of everything he had stood for, everything he had fought for. The engine of his restored motorcycle purred steadily beneath him as he navigated the winding roads that led out of Riverbend and toward the countryside. It had been years since he'd traveled this far from home, but he had always loved the open road. The miles ahead stretched out like a promise. The road was quiet, the occasional farmstead passing by in the distance, the wind pulling at the edges of his jacket. The last light of day painted the sky in hues of gold and purple, the fading sun casting long shadows over the land. It felt peaceful, like a moment to reflect on a life well lived. Sam wasn't just riding for nostalgia. He was riding to remember, to honor the past he'd lived through, the wars, the battles, the losses, to relive the moments when he had fought beside men and women who had given everything for a cause they believed in. He had never spoken much about those years, but they were always with him, just beneath the surface. And though his body was older, slower, his mind was still sharp. The memories were still vivid. As Sam neared the outskirts of the town of Steel Ridge, a small town he had once passed through during his younger years, he noticed something. The once familiar, distant hum of the road was interrupted by the unmistakable roar of motorcycles. The sound seemed to echo from a few miles ahead, growing louder by the second. Sam frowned, his grip tightening on the handlebars. It could be nothing. It could be just a group of local riders enjoying a ride, nothing more. But the instinct he had honed over a lifetime of service told him otherwise. There was something in the way the sound reverberated through the air. It was too coordinated, too organized. A gang, perhaps? His pulse quickened. He slowed down as he approached the town limits, the sight of several riders appearing in the distance. Dark leather, black helmets, and roaring engines. A familiar twinge of tension settled in his chest. These weren't just any riders. This was a crew with intent. They were back. The Red Snakes. The thought of them sent a surge of anger through Sam's veins. He thought they had learned their lesson after Riverbend, but there they were, weaving down the street in formation, not showing any signs of backing down. As he pulled to a stop at the edge of town, he took a moment to assess the situation. The bikers were gathering in the parking lot of a rundown bar on the corner. They were too focused on their bikes and each other to notice Sam sitting just outside the line of sight, watching them intently. They didn't know he was here yet, but Sam knew they would. He wasn't the same man he had been when they first crossed paths. He was older, sure, but he wasn't fragile, and something in him had been reignited, an old fire, a reminder that he wasn't done yet. The thought of letting them take this town the way they had tried with Riverbend was unacceptable. Sam reached down to his motorcycle saddlebag and pulled out a small, faded flag, the same one he had carried with him in his military days. It was more than just a symbol. It was a part of who he was, a representation of honor, sacrifice, and a promise to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. It had never failed him before. He was sure it wouldn't now. Taking a deep breath, Sam kicked the stand of his bike and stood up, feeling the weight of his years but not the weight of defeat. The same sense of resolve that had carried him through every battle, every hardship, rose up within him. With a determined stride, he headed toward the bar. The bikers were clustered around the building, laughing and drinking, oblivious to the presence of the old man walking their way. One of the younger bikers, a tall man with tattoos running down his arms, noticed Sam first. He sneered, a familiar look of disdain crossing his face as he approached. "Well, well, well," the biker said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's this? The old man from Riverbend? You're not scared to be out here alone, Are you? Sam didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto the man, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. There was no room for fear in Sam's heart. He had been through far too much to be afraid of a bunch of men who didn't even know the meaning of courage. "I'm not here to start trouble," Sam said, his voice steady, but it carried with an unmistakable weight. "I'm here to make sure you remember where you've been. Riverbend was just the beginning. Don't think you can roll into this town the same way." The biker laughed, stepping closer, trying to intimidate. "You think you can stop us? You're just a worn-out old man. What are you gonna do?" Sam took a step forward, closing the gap between them. "You don't know the first thing about me, boy," he said, his voice low but sharp as a razor. "And if you think you're going to scare me, you've got another thing coming." The biker hesitated, sensing the weight in Sam's words, but his bravado took over. "You'll regret this, old man. We don't forget." Sam raised his chin, his resolve unshaken. "You may not forget, but you will learn. You may have power in numbers, but I've got something you'll never have." He paused, locking eyes with the gang, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Honor." The bikers exchanged glances, unsure what to make of the old man's words. Sam didn't wait for them to decide. He turned and walked toward the town center, knowing that no matter what came next, he had made his stand. In Riverbend, his legacy was already cemented. But here, in Steel Ridge, the story was just beginning. The tension in Steel Ridge was palpable. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small towns, about the old man who had confronted the red snakes. Some people whispered in disbelief, others with admiration, but all were watching closely. They had seen the bikers come through town before, bullying and threatening, claiming territory. But this time, something was different. A sense of unease hung in the air, and it wasn't just because of the bikers. Sam had always believed in the power of one voice, one stand against the tide. He wasn't the kind of man who sought the spotlight, but when he spoke, people listened. Even at his age, there was something about his presence, a quiet strength, a fire that still burned despite the years. And in Steel Ridge, that fire began to spark. The next morning, the local sheriff, a man in his mid-40s named Clayton Garrison, paid a visit to Sam. He was a big man, broad-shouldered with a square jaw that had seen years of work on the job. He had a look about him that made people trust him, but Sam could see the worry in his eyes as he approached. "I heard what happened last night," Garrison said, his voice low but firm. "You know, I should have warned you. The red snakes are trouble. They've been pushing their way through every town they pass, and I've been doing my best to keep them in line. But—" Sam nodded. He had known Garrison from when he was younger, but they'd never been close. Still, it was good to know the sheriff understood the gravity of the situation. "They're trouble for sure," Sam replied, his voice calm. "But they've got one thing wrong. This isn't just another town they can roll into and take over. I'm not letting that happen again." "I respect that," Garrison said, shaking his head. "But Sam, you're talking about going up against a group that's been doing this for years. They're organized, and they don't take kindly to threats. I'm not sure how much help I can give you." Sam stared out toward the horizon, where the red snakes had gathered the previous night. His mind was working quickly, calculating the best way to handle this. You don't have to fight them alone. That's the mistake people make when they face down a bully. They think it's all on them. But it's not. Garrison raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we rally the town," Sam said. "You'd be surprised at how many people here aren't as quiet as they seem. The townsfolk, they've been dealing with the red snake's threats for a while. They just need a reason to stand up." "I don't know," Garrison said, his tone hesitant. "People here have families, jobs. It's a lot to ask." "Sometimes," Sam said, his gaze unwavering, "it only takes one person to start a change. And when that spark hits, the rest will follow. We're not asking for a war. We're just asking for the town to remember what it's worth defending." The sheriff was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the gravity of Sam's words. Finally, he sighed. "I'll help. I don't know if the rest of the town will go along with it, but I'll back you." Sam clapped him on the shoulder. "That's all I need." Over the next few hours, word spread through Steel Ridge. The town had seen its fair share of tough times. Economic downturns, floods, the occasional out-of-towner looking to stir up trouble, but it had always managed to bounce back. The people had something the bikers didn't, a deep sense of community. At the town square later that afternoon, Sam stood in front of a small crowd. Garrison had helped to gather a mix of locals, shopkeepers, farmers, a few retired veterans, even some young adults who had moved away and returned. All were quiet, unsure of what they could do, but ready to listen. Sam looked over the crowd. Most of them had seen the red snakes ride into town, and most of them had backed down, hoping the bikers would just leave. But there was something different now. Sam was there, and he wasn't backing down. He wasn't asking for their approval. He was asking for their action. "We've been through a lot in this town," Sam began, his voice strong but without a hint of arrogance. "Some of us have seen hard times, lost loved ones, fought battles that left scars we can't see. But no matter what happens, we've always had one thing, each other. And that's something no one can take from us." He paused, looking at the faces in the crowd. "The red snakes think they can come in here and take whatever they want. But we're not just going to hand it over. Not this time. Not while I'm still breathing." A murmur passed through the crowd. Some nodded, others shifted uneasily, but Sam could see that the seed was planted. "We don't need to be heroes," he continued, "but we need to be ready. We need to show these bikers that Steel Ridge is our town, and we'll stand together to protect it. No one fights alone." The crowd was silent for a long moment, and then, one by one, people began to speak up. An elderly woman who had once run the local diner spoke about the way the bikers had stolen her supplies during their last visit. A young man, recently returned from a stint in the military, volunteered to help organize the town's defenses. The sheriff nodded along, agreeing to coordinate efforts with the locals. For the first time in a long while, the people of Steel Ridge felt a spark of unity. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about standing for something greater. The Red Snakes had underestimated this town, and Sam knew that now. The game was changing. Back at the bar, the Red Snakes were oblivious to the shift happening in Steel Ridge. But Sam wasn't done yet. He had one more move to make. The people had come together, but they needed one more thing. A leader. Sam wasn't just going to fight for them. He was going to fight with them. And that made all the difference. With the resolve in his heart stronger than ever, Sam turned toward the looming shadows of the Red Snake's hideout. It was time to show them just how far Steel Ridge was willing to go. The night before the confrontation, Steel Ridge hummed with a nervous energy. Sam had gathered everyone who was willing to stand beside him. Together with Sheriff Garrison, they had devised a plan that would give them the best chance at not only surviving the bikers' assault, but driving them out for good. The sheriff had already contacted some of his trusted deputies, but Sam knew it was the locals who would make the difference. The bikers were used to having the upper hand. They were loud, brash, and organized. But Steel Ridge had something the Red Snakes didn't: heart. And it was a force that Sam had spent decades nurturing. The plan was simple. Catch them off guard, disrupt their usual intimidation tactics, and show them that Steel Ridge wasn't afraid anymore. Sam knew it wouldn't be easy. The Red Snakes had a reputation for being ruthless, but he wasn't about to back down now. As the sun set and darkness crept across the town, Sam stood at the edge of the square, looking over the small group of townsfolk who had answered the call. Some were holding flashlights, others carrying makeshift weapons, baseball bats, shovels, even a few old hunting rifles that hadn't seen use in years. Garrison approached him, his face set in determination. "You sure about this? We're not gonna back down, but we need to be smart. They'll fight dirty." "I know," Sam replied, his voice steady, "but they don't know the land like we do. We'll use that to our advantage. Get the roads blocked at both ends of town. Get the back alleys covered. Keep them on their toes." Sheriff Garrison nodded and turned to give orders. Sam watched as people began to spread out, taking their positions quietly but with purpose. There was a sense of urgency in the air, but also something else, something Sam hadn't felt in years: hope. He walked over to the edge of the square, where the town's old train tracks ran like forgotten veins beneath the dim streetlights. The tracks had been quiet for years. No trains had passed through Steel Ridge in over a decade. But tonight, they felt like the lifeblood of the town, a reminder of better times. And if he had anything to do with it, they would be a part of this fight. As the first headlights appeared on the horizon, Sam's heart raced. The red snakes were approaching. "They're here," someone whispered from behind him. It was young Kyle, the former military vet who had returned home a few months ago. His eyes were sharp, scanning the road ahead. Sam nodded. "Let's make sure they don't like what they find." The bikes roared into town, their engines a thunderous reminder of what Steel Ridge had been up against. The red snakes, clad in their trademark leather jackets and bandanas, slowed as they neared the center of town. They had been expecting a quiet, easy raid, the kind of thing they could finish off with a few threats and a quick grab of supplies. But instead, they found the streets lined with the people of Steel Ridge, armed and resolute. The leader of the Red Snakes, a hulking man named Razor, slowed his bike as he saw the scene unfolding. He was known for his cruel nature and his tight grip on his gang. When he saw Sam standing in the middle of the street, his lip curled into a sneer. "Well, well," Razor called out, revving his engine. "The old man wants to play hero. You think you can stop us, Grandpa?" Sam didn't flinch. He stood tall, his weathered face hard as stone. "I think you've mistaken this town for one of your easy targets. You're not welcome here, Razor. Not anymore." The gang leader chuckled darkly, the sound echoing off the buildings. "You think the townsfolk are going to help you? Look around. They're scared. You're all scared." "We're not scared," Sam said, his voice rising. "And you're not in charge here." A tense silence fell over the street. The red snakes shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. Razor's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected the town to fight back like this. "You want to throw it all away for this little patch of dirt?" Razor asked, his tone mocking. "You think these people are going to risk their lives for some old man?" Sam's eyes locked onto Razor's with a quiet fury. "They're risking it because they believe in this town. And you're not taking it from them. Not without a fight." The tension snapped when one of the townsfolk, a woman named Ruth who ran the local general store, stepped forward. She held a crowbar in her hand, her stance firm. "He's right," she said, her voice clear. "You're not welcome here." Several more people joined her, stepping out from the shadows, armed with whatever they had been able to find. Garrison and his deputies flanked the group, and the rest of the townsfolk spread out, taking up positions that made it clear they were ready to defend their home. Razor growled and revved his engine again, but there was something in the air now, something that made him hesitate. He had dealt with plenty of people over the years who had cowered at the sight of his gang, but this was different. Steel Ridge wasn't bowing down. "You'll regret this," Razor snarled. "We'll take what we want, and we'll burn what's left to the ground." With that, the red snakes began to circle the square, ready to charge. But Sam had anticipated this. He had prepared. A loud whistle echoed through the air, followed by the sound of shifting gears. The first barricade, made of old rusted cars, rolled into the street, blocking their way. The townsfolk had set it up earlier, and now it was in place, solid and immovable. "You're not going anywhere," Sam said, stepping forward. "Not until you've learned the meaning of leave us alone." The red snakes hesitated, their bikes idling as they assessed the situation. Razor's face twisted in rage as he realized the game had changed. This wasn't just a small-town standoff. It was a stand for something much bigger. The battle for Steel Ridge had begun, and Sam wasn't going to let the town he loved fall without a fight. The tension in the air was palpable as Razor and his gang circled the barricade, revving their engines, looking for a way through. The streets, now lined with townsfolk, stood like an impenetrable wall. The sound of the motorcycles echoed down the empty streets, but there was no retreat, no easy exit. Sam stood at the forefront, facing the red snakes with calm defiance. "Last chance," Razor growled, his eyes flashing with rage. "Move the barricade, or this will get ugly." Sam shook his head slowly. "You've already made it ugly by coming here. We don't want this fight, Razor, but we won't back down." A cold silence followed his words. Sam could see the hesitation in Razor's eyes. The red snakes were a pack of wolves, but even wolves could be cowed when they realized they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The townspeople, too, had steeled themselves. They were ready to stand firm, whatever came next. Razor snarled, his hand clenching into a fist, and then raised it high.
Attack!
The gang roared in unison, their engines revving as they charged forward, weapons raised. But before they could make it halfway to the barricade, the first shot rang out. It wasn't from the deputies. It came from one of the townsfolk, a farmer named Bill, who had spent years hunting in the woods. He didn't fire to kill, but to scare, sending a warning shot into the air. That was all it took. The red snakes skidded to a halt, their bikes grinding against the pavement as they hesitated. The uncertainty that Sam had hoped for was there. Razor's eyes flicked nervously around the town, and it was clear. He wasn't used to resistance like this. "We don't want to fight you," Sheriff Garrison called out, stepping forward with his badge held high. "But you'll have to answer for the trouble you've caused in Steel Ridge. You're not welcome here anymore." Razor's grip on his handlebars tightened. He was used to terrorizing small towns, to forcing them to submit, but something about this night felt different. He was used to getting what he wanted through fear. But Steel Ridge wasn't afraid, not anymore. The silence stretched between the two sides. The gang's tension mirrored that of the town, everyone waiting for the first move. Then, from the corner of Sam's eye, he saw movement. A figure was darting from the side, and in a flash, one of the townsfolk, young Kyle, stepped into view. He was carrying a flare gun, and with swift precision, he fired it straight into the air. The flare shot up, glowing bright red and lighting up the dark sky, creating a dazzling arc of light. The moment it reached its peak, it exploded into a cascade of brilliant sparks. It wasn't just a signal, it was a declaration. "Look!" Kyle shouted, pointing behind the gang. The red snakes turned, their eyes widening as a fleet of vehicles appeared on the horizon. It was the rest of the town, everyone who had stayed behind, mobilizing at the last moment. A mix of farm trucks, old station wagons, and even a couple of beat-up school buses appeared, converging from the outskirts of town. They weren't an army, but they were a united front, and that was enough to send a clear message. Razor's eyes flicked back to Sam, his face darkening with realization. They were surrounded. "This ends now," Sam said, his voice unwavering. Razor's jaw clenched. He didn't want to fight a losing battle, especially not with a town ready to stand its ground. But the pride of the Red Snakes wouldn't let him back down easily. He looked to his gang, who seemed as torn as he was, unsure whether to keep pushing or to retreat. The standoff continued, both sides tense, but it was clear that Sam's unwavering resolve had shifted the balance of power. No matter how tough Razor and his gang were, they didn't have the heart of the town behind them. Finally, Razor spat on the ground and revved his engine again. "This isn't over, old man. You'll pay for this. We'll be back." Without another word, he gunned his bike and tore off down the road, followed by his gang. The others hesitated for a moment longer, looking back at Sam and the townsfolk, before they too sped off, disappearing into the night. For a moment, the world stood still. The only sound was the fading roar of the motorcycles, now a distant hum. Sam stood in the center of the street, watching as the dust settled. The town was safe, for now. Sheriff Garrison let out a long breath, lowering his gun. "That was one hell of a stand, Sam." Sam nodded, though his face remained serious. "It's not over. Not until they know we're not afraid." The townsfolk gathered around, cheering, clapping each other on the back. But Sam's mind was already ahead. The Red Snakes had been driven off, but this wasn't the end of their problems. There would be more battles, more tests of their resolve. But for the first time in a long time, Sam felt a glimmer of hope. He knew they had just turned a corner. Steel Ridge might not be a big town, but it was their town, and as long as Sam had breath in his lungs, he wasn't about to let anyone take it from them. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice firm. "We've got work to do. But tonight we've shown what this town is made of." The townsfolk gathered closer, united in their victory. And for the first time in years, Sam felt the weight of his age lift, replaced by the strength of the community he had fought to protect. The battle for Steel Ridge was far from over, but they had won the first victory, and that was enough for now. The next few days in Steel Ridge were filled with a strange mixture of relief and unease. The Red Snakes were gone, for now, but Sam knew better than to believe they wouldn't return. Razor had promised as much, and men like him rarely kept their word in the way people hoped. The town, still buzzing with the aftermath of their hard-earned victory, was quieter than usual. The roads were no longer filled with the threatening hum of the gang's engines, but there was a palpable sense of waiting in the air, as if everyone was holding their breath. Sam spent the following morning walking through the main street, his boots crunching on the gravel, pausing occasionally to speak with townsfolk. There was a sense of pride in their eyes now, pride that they had stood together and sent the red snakes packing. But Sam also saw the worry beneath that pride. No one was fooled into thinking it was over. Sheriff Garrison met Sam outside the diner, wiping his hands on his pants as he stepped down from the porch. "We need to talk." "About what?" Sam asked, though he already had an inkling of what was coming. "About what happens next." Garrison's face was serious, his eyes scanning the town as if searching for something. "You know as well as I do that Razor isn't the type to take defeat lying down. He'll be back." Sam nodded. "I know." There was a long silence between them before Garrison spoke again. "We need a plan, Sam. And I mean a real one. The town's not prepared for what's coming, and it's not just the gang. The law, too. They don't like the way we handled this." "The law can't stop us if we stand together," Sam replied firmly. "We did the right thing. The only thing. And we can do it again." Garrison looked at him, then sighed. "I hope you're right. But we both know it's going to take more than just standing tall. We need allies, people who can help us defend this town. And that means reaching out to the folks in the neighboring counties, maybe even further." Sam's heart skipped a beat at the thought of widening the circle of resistance. It was a good idea, but it wasn't without risks. The Red Snakes weren't the only problem. There were other gangs out there, other factions that would see Steel Ridge as an easy target. And if word got out that they were organizing, it could attract the attention of more dangerous forces. "We'll need to be careful," Sam said, his voice low. "This town survived on its own for a long time, and I'd like to keep it that way. But I'll consider it. We need all the help we can get." As the days passed, Sam found himself in countless conversations, not just with Sheriff Garrison, but with every man, woman, and child in Steel Ridge. They were all in this together, and Sam was beginning to realize that the strength of a town wasn't just in its walls or its weapons. It was in the people. One evening, as the sun began to set and the town slowly emptied into their homes, Sam found himself sitting outside his cabin, staring out at the distant mountains. The light was fading, and with it, the last remnants of warmth from the day. A truck pulled up beside him, its engine sputtering as it came to a stop. The door creaked open, and out stepped Kyle, the young man who had fired the flare during the standoff. Kyle had been quieter than usual since that night, still adjusting to the role he had played in the defense of Steel Ridge. "You all right, Kyle?" Sam asked, turning to face him. Kyle nodded, but there was a weight in his eyes. "Just thinking, I guess. We did it, didn't we? We won." "We did," Sam said, his voice soft. "But it's not over. I've seen enough in my time to know that. We need to stay sharp." Kyle walked over and sat next to Sam, his gaze lingering on the horizon. "I don't know what comes next, but I'm with you. Whatever you need, I'll be there." Sam smiled, clapping Kyle on the shoulder. "You've already proven yourself, son. But this isn't just about what I need. It's about what this town needs. We all have a part to play." As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Sam felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The storm had come, and they had weathered it. But there was no denying the truth. A storm like that never truly passed. It only changed form. The next morning, the sun rose over Steel Ridge, casting its golden light over the small town. Sam was already up, standing on the porch of his cabin, his hands resting on the railing as he watched the world wake up. There was work to be done, plans to make, defenses to strengthen, alliances to form. But today was the first day of the rest of Steel Ridge's life. Sam had no illusions that it would be easy, but he knew that as long as the town stood united, as long as they had the courage to face whatever came their way, they had a fighting chance. Steel Ridge wasn't just a town. It was a community, and that, Sam thought with a grim smile, was something no gang could ever take away. The road ahead was long, but they would walk it together. The following weeks were a blur of activity. The people of Steel Ridge were busy fortifying their homes, repairing what had been damaged in the skirmish with the red snakes, and, above all, preparing for the inevitable return of Razor and his gang. Sam knew they couldn't afford to wait idly by. Razor had lost a battle, but he hadn't lost his hunger for control. Sheriff Garrison kept up his patrols, but now the deputies were working in shifts, doubling their presence on the streets. The more seasoned townsfolk, those who had lived in Steel Ridge long enough to remember the old ways, joined in to train the younger generation, teaching them how to handle firearms, set up defensive barricades, and move as a unit. Kyle was among the eager recruits, spending most of his time with the men and women who had been part of the town's defense during the last showdown. He was quieter now, more serious, as though the weight of what they had survived had matured him in ways Sam hadn't expected. One evening, as dusk settled over the mountains, a man from the neighboring town of Colhust arrived at Sam's cabin. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a rough-hewn face, his clothes dusty from the road. His name was Jonah Harris, and he had come with news that Steel Ridge might find more allies than they had hoped for. "I've heard whispers from the folks in Colhust," Jonah said as he sat down across from Sam. "There's been talk of a bigger problem than the Red Snakes. Some of the larger gangs in the region are starting to make moves. There's a group called the Vultures. They're looking to expand their territory, and they've already started setting their sights on Steel Ridge." Sam leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "The Vultures? I've heard of them. They're ruthless." "They're worse than ruthless," Jonah replied. "They're organized, well-funded. They've got numbers, weapons, everything they need to take over towns like this. If they catch wind of Steel Ridge making a stand against the Snakes, they'll come down hard." Sam's mind raced. The Vultures weren't a gang to take lightly. They were more than just trouble. They were a force that could destroy everything Steel Ridge had fought for. "How do you know all this?" Sam asked. Jonah glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "I've got some contacts. People who want to stop the Vultures from taking over, but they can't do it alone. They're willing to help. They've got arms, resources, and more importantly, experience fighting these kinds of groups." Sam's heart quickened. Help was something they desperately needed, but it came with a cost. "And what do they want in return?" "They want us to stand with them," Jonah said, his voice low. "It's not just Steel Ridge that's at risk. If the Vultures take this place, they'll start spreading out. Colhust, others along the way. But the people who are willing to help, they're not asking for much. They just need a sign that we're ready to fight." The conversation turned serious then, and they discussed logistics, alliances, and the risks involved. In the end, Sam knew what had to be done. They couldn't face the Vultures alone. They would need to reach out for help, even if it meant placing their trust in people they didn't fully know. Sam stood up, looking out at the quiet town of Steel Ridge. The stars above seemed to shine with an almost eerie clarity, as if the world was watching. "We'll need to make a stand," Sam said, his voice steady. "And we'll need to show everyone that we're not just fighting for our survival. We're fighting for the soul of this town. I won't let it fall into the hands of anyone who thinks they can just take it." Jonah nodded. "I'll spread the word. The people who want to help will answer the call. But we'll need to be ready for anything." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Word spread quickly through the neighboring towns, and soon, a group of like-minded individuals began to filter into Steel Ridge. Some were seasoned fighters. Others were farmers and ranchers who had never fired a gun before but were willing to learn. Sam and Sheriff Garrison met with each group, assessing their skills and organizing them into teams. Kyle was becoming a natural leader among the younger fighters, showing the same calm resolve he had demonstrated during the confrontation with the Red Snakes. He had spent countless hours in training, sharpening his skills and passing on what he had learned. As Sam walked through the makeshift camp the night before the planned meeting with their new allies, he saw the determination in the eyes of the people. They were ready. They were scared too, but they weren't backing down. When the sun rose the next morning, Sam stood at the head of the makeshift training ground, overlooking the assembled fighters. Jonah's people had arrived, along with reinforcements from Colhust and beyond. It was a ragtag group, but it was theirs, and Sam knew it was enough. "This isn't just about defending Steel Ridge anymore," Sam said to them, his voice carrying across the field. "It's about sending a message. We will not let the Vultures or anyone else tear us apart. We stand united, or we fall. But if we fall, we do so on our terms. The crowd cheered, and Sam felt a flicker of hope spark in his chest. It wasn't much yet, but it was a start. They had made their choice, and they were ready to face whatever the future held. That night, as the campfires flickered and the sounds of the night settled in, Sam stood by the fire with Kyle and Jonah, watching the stars overhead. "We're as ready as we'll ever be," Sam said, his tone heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Kyle looked at him, his expression steady. "We're not doing this just for Steel Ridge, are we? We're doing this for everyone." Sam met his gaze. "Yeah, we're doing this for everyone." And with that, they prepared for the battle that was coming, knowing it would shape the future of not only Steel Ridge but the entire region. The vultures were coming, but Steel Ridge would not be an easy prize. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and dust from the dry, rugged terrain surrounding Steel Ridge. Sam stood at the head of the assembly, his eyes scanning the faces of the men and women who had come to fight. They were ready, though he could see the nerves hidden beneath their hardened expressions. It wasn't just about the battle ahead. It was about everything they stood to lose. Jonah and his people had worked tirelessly in the days leading up to the fight, training the recruits, ensuring they knew how to defend themselves and how to stand together. The group had formed a solid defense perimeter around the town, with lookouts on the ridges and supplies stashed in hidden caches. Even the youngest fighters had been given simple tasks to keep them involved and prepared, their nervous energy being directed into something productive. Kyle stood at Sam's side, his young face a mixture of resolve and youthful excitement. The adrenaline was already coursing through him. He had trained well, but Sam knew that nothing could truly prepare them for the violence that would unfold. "We've got about 4 hours until they're supposed to arrive," Jonah said, his deep voice carrying a quiet authority. "I don't know how many there'll be, but from the intel I've gathered, it could be anywhere between 30 to 50 of them." Sam nodded grimly. "We'll make it hard for them to come in. We'll hit them as they come down the pass. The trees and hills will give us the cover we need." The plan was simple. They would position their forces in key locations around Steel Ridge. The more experienced fighters would be stationed along the ridges overlooking the main road, while others would hold ground in the town itself, setting traps and prepared to fight hand-to-hand if necessary. Sheriff Garrison moved through the group, checking weapons, adjusting the positions of the fighters. The usual tension in the air was replaced with a quiet focus. They weren't waiting for a fight anymore. They were making it clear that Steel Ridge would stand its ground. As the hours passed, Sam could feel the sense of inevitability settle over him. He had spent his life protecting others, but this fight was unlike anything he had ever faced. Razor and the Red Snakes were ruthless, but the Vultures were a different breed. They were mercenaries, organized and deadly, and their reputation for bloodshed was known far and wide. But Sam had lived through worse, and as far as he was concerned, Steel Ridge was his home. It wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of what people could build when they had the will to stand together. Kyle approached, gripping his rifle tightly, his face pale but determined. "Sam, what if we don't win?" His voice was quieter now, stripped of the bravado he usually carried. Sam looked at the boy, the weight of his words settling in his chest. "If we don't win, Kyle, then we make sure they know we fought like hell for this place. We make sure they remember that we didn't go down quietly, but we're going to win. This is our fight, and we're not backing down." Kyle nodded, swallowing hard as he tightened his grip on his weapon. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready. The sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land. As the day turned to night, the tension was unbearable. Everyone knew the battle was coming, but it still hadn't arrived. The wind carried the sound of distant hooves, and for a moment, Sam's heart skipped a beat. "Here they come," Jonah said, his eyes sharp as he scanned the horizon. Through the thickening dusk, the outlines of horses and riders began to emerge on the road leading into Steel Ridge. Sam took a deep breath and motioned for the team to take their positions. In the distance, Razor's flag, an unmistakable red banner with a black vulture emblem, fluttered ominously in the wind. Sam's hand gripped the hilt of his rifle. "Hold your fire until they're within range," he said to the men and women around him, his voice low but firm. The riders slowed as they neared the town, their faces hard, their intentions clear. They had come to claim Steel Ridge for themselves, and they weren't expecting much resistance. They would soon realize how wrong they were. As Razor and his men drew closer, Sam gave the signal. A single shot rang out from the ridge, followed by several others. The vultures scattered, seeking cover behind boulders and the trees. They had been ambushed, and their surprise quickly turned into fury. Razor shouted orders, but his men were already in disarray. Steel Ridge's defenders moved with precision, using the cover of darkness and their knowledge of the land to launch surprise attacks. It wasn't just the rifles that had the vultures on edge, it was the guerrilla tactics. Every time they thought they had found an advantage, they were flanked. Sam led the charge from the center, his rifle at the ready, his every movement calculated. He shot once, twice, each time hitting a target. The air was thick with gunfire, the sound of hooves pounding the dirt, the shouts and cries of battle. Kyle moved up beside him, firing with precision. He was no longer the nervous young man who had asked what would happen if they lost. He was a soldier in that moment, focused, determined, and unafraid. Jonah's group flanked from the other side, pushing Razor's men back further into the open field. Steel Ridge was holding its ground. They weren't just defending, they were making the vultures pay for every inch of ground they tried to take. But then, from behind a large rock, Razor appeared. His eyes locked on Sam, a sneer crossing his face. "You think you can stop us?" he spat. Sam didn't answer. Instead, he took aim, firing a single shot. Razor fell back, the sound of the bullet hitting him ringing in Sam's ears. The remaining vultures hesitated. The leader had fallen. Within moments, Steel Ridge's defenders closed in, and the tide began to turn. Razor's men, leaderless and demoralized, began to retreat. The battle, which had felt like it would last forever, began to wind down. By the time the last of the vultures had fled, the silence of the battlefield was deafening. Sam stood, breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the field. The fight had been brutal, but they had won. Steel Ridge had held its ground. Kyle came up beside him, his face smeared with dirt and blood, but his eyes alight with relief. "We did it," he said, barely able to believe it. Sam looked out at the town they had fought so fiercely to protect. "Yeah, we did. But this isn't over. We've sent a message today, and now we have to make sure it sticks." As the sun rose over Steel Ridge, they knew the fight was far from finished. Razor and the vultures had learned what it meant to challenge a town that wouldn't back down. Steel Ridge had been tested, and it had come through stronger than ever. The battle was won, but the war for their future had only just begun. The battle was over, but the war wasn't. Steel Ridge had won its first true test of survival, and yet the aftershocks of the conflict rippled through the town. Sam stood in the center of the street, his eyes scanning the damage. The fight had taken a toll. Some homes had been scorched by fire, others had their windows shattered from the hail of gunfire. But the town had stood firm. People were alive. The vultures had been driven back. For now, Sheriff Garrison had ordered his deputies to gather the bodies of the fallen. Razor's men had been littered across the fields surrounding Steel Ridge, some still, others barely clinging to life. Steel Ridge had no room for mercy in this battle, not when their survival was on the line. Kyle was cleaning his rifle near the sheriff's office, his shoulders hunched as he worked. The young man had been through something he could never unsee, but Sam could tell he was finding his resolve. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was a soldier. And as much as Sam wanted to shield him from this violence, he knew that there were no easy choices now. The world was changing. Steel Ridge had to adapt. "How's he holding up?" Jonah asked, his voice low as he approached Sam. Sam glanced over at the young man, then back at Jonah. "Better than I thought. He's tough." Jonah nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. They had both seen young men and women thrust into conflict before. Most didn't come out unscarred, but some became warriors in the process. "We've got about 2 days, maybe 3, before Razor pulls together another crew. They won't forget this," Jonah said, his expression grim. "And the next time, it might not just be Razor. Word travels fast in this part of the world." Sam clenched his jaw. "I know, but we've shown them we're not easy pickings. We've got the firepower, the will, and the unity. Steel Ridge isn't just some ghost town they can walk all over. True, Jonah replied, but they're organized, and they've got allies. Razor won't be alone next time. We might need to start thinking about alliances of our own. Sam considered it. Steel Ridge had always been a place of independence. They were self-sufficient, not reliant on others. But in a world where power was measured by the barrel of a gun, alliances were becoming an unavoidable reality. Let's start with the closest towns. It's time to make a few calls. Later that evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with streaks of red and orange, the leaders of Steel Ridge gathered in the makeshift town hall. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat, a small comfort after the devastation of the day. Sam sat at the head of the table, looking around at the faces of those who had stood by him. Sheriff Garrison, Jonah, Kyle, and a few others, townsfolk, farmers, tradespeople, were all present. Now that the battle's over, we need to make sure we're ready for what's coming next, Sam began. Razor's already calling for reinforcements, and there are others like him out there. We need to fortify Steel Ridge, build up our defenses, get our people trained, and secure resources. Garrison leaned forward, his eyes sharp. I'll reach out to the other towns. If we can get reinforcements and supplies, we might stand a chance. But we need more than just fighters. We need money, weapons, food. The longer we survive out here, the more we'll need to keep going. Kyle, sitting near the back, spoke up. What about the vultures? They won't just disappear, right? They're going to keep coming after us. That's the plan, Jonah said. They'll regroup, but so will we. It's not just about surviving anymore. It's about fighting smart. We can't let them dictate the terms. We control the territory now. If we keep hitting them where it hurts, they'll think twice before trying again. Sam nodded. That's right. We'll build a network, talk to the other towns, see who's willing to join us. If we can get a coalition together, we might be able to put a stop to Razor and his crew once and for all. The idea of a coalition had its risks, Sam knew. Trust was fragile in this world, especially between towns and people who hadn't seen eye to eye before. But Steel Ridge had proven something important, that it was stronger when it stood together. The meeting continued long into the night, discussions ranging from fortifications to supply chains to how best to spread word of Steel Ridge's victory. Every person had a role to play, and Sam made sure no one felt left out. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs. The days after the battle were filled with preparation. Sam and his people worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been damaged, but they also strengthened their defenses. Steel Ridge was a town on edge, but it had become something more, a symbol of resistance, a beacon to those who still believed in survival and self-determination. Word spread quickly about the defeat of Razor and the Vultures. Some towns welcomed the news, seeing it as a chance to unite against the growing threat. Others were skeptical, unwilling to commit to the fight. Sam knew that Steel Ridge would need to lead by example. They couldn't rely on others. They had to show the world that they were capable of protecting themselves and standing strong. Jonah had already sent out scouts to nearby settlements, gauging their willingness to join the effort. Some had agreed to send reinforcements. Others wanted more guarantees. And a few simply refused to take part in a war they didn't believe was theirs. As the days passed, the tension between Steel Ridge and the outside world grew. The Vultures were not finished, and neither was the fragile peace that held the region together. Sam could feel the weight of the coming storm, but he also felt something else, hope. If Steel Ridge could hold on, if they could stand together against the forces that threatened to swallow them whole, then maybe, just maybe, they could carve out a future for themselves in this broken world. But that future was still far from certain. The next battle would be harder. Razor's vengeance would be swift and brutal, and in the distance, other enemies were stirring. The calm before the storm was over. The next chapter in Steel Ridge's fight for survival was just beginning. Steel Ridge had become a fortress in the months since the battle with the Vultures. The once quiet town now buzzed with the sounds of construction and training. The streets that had once been full of dust and old memories were now lined with barricades, watchtowers, and makeshift walls built by the hands of people who had long since given up on the idea of rest. Sam stood at the edge of town, watching the horizon as dark clouds gathered in the distance. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a thunderstorm. He could feel it in his bones. The enemy was out there, somewhere, preparing to strike. Think they'll come for us first? Jonah asked, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the same unease that weighed on Sam's shoulders. They've got to, Sam replied, his gaze never leaving the horizon. We took their leader, and we've made a statement. Razor won't let it slide. Jonah didn't say anything more, but Sam knew what was on his mind. The vultures weren't the only problem anymore. Word of Steelridge's resistance had spread, and with it, the interest of other, more dangerous forces. Every town around them had its own reasons for wanting to stay out of a conflict, but the idea of joining forces with Steelridge had begun to look more appealing to some. The young man Kyle had been leading patrols on the outskirts of Steelridge, his eyes sharper now than when Sam first took him in. He was a soldier now, learning the harsh truths of survival in a world that didn't forgive. How's the patrol going? Sam called out as Kyle approached, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Kyle gave a short nod, his face drawn with exhaustion. We've spotted more movement from Razor's men. They're staying out of sight, but they're getting closer. Sam ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. How many? Hard to say. Not a full crew, but enough to cause trouble. They're moving in smaller groups, trying to stay under the radar. Smart, Jonah said, a grim smile tugging at his lips. Razor's not dumb. If he thinks we're too prepared, he'll start hitting us in smaller, more unpredictable ways. We'll be ready for that, Sam assured them both, his voice firm. Steelridge doesn't break that easily. As the days went by, more reinforcements arrived from the neighboring towns that had agreed to join their cause. The coalition was growing, albeit slowly. It was a mix of people, farmers, traders, outcasts, and warriors, each with their own reasons for fighting, but all united by one common purpose: to stop the vultures and anyone else who threatened their survival. That night, under the cover of darkness, a small group of riders arrived in Steelridge. They were grim-faced, cloaked in the dust of the road, and carrying weapons that spoke of a long journey through uncertain territory. Sam, one of them said, stepping forward. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down the side of his face. I'm Josiah. We've heard what's happening here, and we're here to help. Josiah was the leader of a group from the nearby town of Ridgewood, a place known for its strong defenses but isolated from the larger conflicts brewing in the region. It had taken them a while to decide, but they had finally chosen Steelridge over the vultures. Glad you made it, Sam replied, shaking the man's hand. We could use all the help we can get. You're not the only ones, Josiah said, his eyes narrowing. There's more coming, from all directions. Razor's got enemies too. Some of the bigger players in the region are starting to take notice of him. This could get ugly. Uglier than it already is? Sam muttered, half to himself. He was starting to understand the depth of what they were facing. This wasn't just about surviving Razor's assault anymore. It was about surviving in a world where everyone had their own piece of land, their own interests, and their own fight. We've got a few days to prepare, Josiah continued, looking over at the fortified town. Razor's men might be quiet now, but they're planning something. And when they hit, they'll be coming for us all. The realization hit Sam harder than he expected. This wasn't just a fight for Steelridge. It was a fight for the future of everyone who still believed in the possibility of a new order. A future where they could live without fear of roving gangs, corrupt rulers, or the lawless chaos that had defined the world for so long. The next few days were a blur of planning, training, and preparation. The town had become a hive of activity, with every person playing their part in the coming fight. Those who couldn't fight prepared supplies, reinforced walls, or tended to the wounded. Others worked with Kyle and Jonah to scout out possible routes of attack, while Sam stayed in constant contact with Josiah and the other leaders, discussing strategies. The threat of Razor was no longer just a shadow. It was a certainty. Razor's group had been quiet for too long. Sam could feel the storm brewing. They had only a few days before the vultures would strike, but Sam had no intention of waiting for them to come to Steelridge. They would take the fight to them. They would show Razor and the other warlords that Steelridge wasn't just a town. It was a movement. In the dead of night, Sam gathered his core group, Jonah, Kyle, Josiah, and a few of the other trusted fighters. They would ride out before dawn, strike the vultures while they were still scattered, and return to Steel Ridge with a blow that would make the world take notice. Razor might be ruthless, but he had underestimated Steel Ridge, and by the time they were done, no one would doubt that Steel Ridge was more than just a town. They were a force to be reckoned with. "Tomorrow, we make our stand," Sam said, his voice heavy with the weight of what they were about to do. "No more waiting. We take this fight to them." The group nodded, their faces set with grim determination. The winds of change were blowing, and Steel Ridge would either rise with them or be swept away. It was time for the storm to break. The early morning light cast long shadows across Steel Ridge as Sam and his group of riders prepared to leave. The town, now fully fortified and bristling with anticipation, felt eerily quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Each rider had their own reasons for joining the cause, but the mission today was clear. Make sure the vultures never saw them coming. As the sun crept above the horizon, Sam stood at the front of the group, his hand resting on the reins of his horse. His gaze was fixed on the distant hills, where Razor's men were rumored to be holed up. He could feel the weight of their lives on his shoulders, the lives of everyone in Steel Ridge and the towns that had allied with them. "We'll keep it quick," Sam said, turning to his team. "In and out. We'll hit Razor's scouts first, then make our way to the main camp. We don't need to wipe them out, just make them bleed. We want them scared, off balance. They won't know what hit him." Jonah gave a grim smile. A little chaos never hurt anyone. Kyle, still new to the full scope of combat, tightened his grip on his weapon. "You sure we can do this? They outnumber us." "We'll have the element of surprise," Sam replied, his tone calm but resolute. "And we know their routes better than they know ours. We move fast, hit hard, and get back before they can retaliate." Josiah, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "I've got a man in Razor's camp. He'll help us get inside. We don't have much time, but it'll be enough." The plan was simple, but it was risky. They would ride out, split into two teams, one to sabotage Razor's supply lines and the other to strike at the heart of the camp. If everything went according to plan, they would leave the vultures disoriented, forcing them to retreat. But Sam knew there was a chance things could go wrong. It was a gamble, but it was one they had to take. The riders set off, their horses kicking up the dry dust of the open plains. The wind was steady, but it felt like it carried with it the whispers of past battles and old grudges. Every mile closer to Razor's camp was a step deeper into the heart of the storm. As they rode, Sam's thoughts wandered back to the people they were leaving behind. Steel Ridge had become more than just a place. It was a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope in a world gone dark. But that hope was fragile. If they failed today, if Razor's men were allowed to regroup and retaliate, it could be the end of everything they'd fought for. "How much further?" Kyle asked, his voice breaking through Sam's thoughts. "We're close," Sam replied, his eyes scanning the horizon. The landscape had shifted from barren plains to rocky terrain, perfect for an ambush. They were getting closer to Razor's stronghold, and every muscle in Sam's body tensed with anticipation. They reached the first ridge, and Sam signaled for the group to stop. Below them, in the valley, Razor's camp sprawled out like a nest of vipers, smaller than they had expected, but still well defended. The vultures were notorious for their brutal tactics, and Sam knew the camp would be filled with traps and hidden sentries. Josiah motioned toward a narrow ravine that would lead them closer to the camp, a path he had used before in his dealings with Razor. "We go this way," he said. "We'll be out of sight and get to the camp undetected." They dismounted and moved on foot, carefully picking their way through the ravine, knowing that any noise could alert the sentries. Sam's mind was sharp, his instincts guiding him through the narrow path. He had done this before, leading smaller groups on raids, but there was something different about this one. This time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming control, about sending a message. They reached the edge of the camp by midday, hidden in the shadow of the rocky cliffs. From here, they could see the vultures' makeshift barricades, the tents strewn across the dusty ground, and the men moving about like a well-oiled machine. Razor's crew was preparing for something, perhaps a bigger attack, Or maybe they were expecting retaliation from Steelridge. Sam's heart raced as he signaled the group to split up. Kyle and Jonah would take the southern flank, where the supply wagons were located, while Sam and Josiah would head straight for the camp's center, where they hoped to disrupt Razor's command and cause chaos among his men. They moved with deadly precision, avoiding patrols and slipping through gaps in the camp's perimeter. Every step felt like an eternity, but Sam's focus never wavered. He could hear the sounds of Razor's men laughing and talking, unaware that the storm was about to hit. Then, without warning, the plan was set into motion. Jonah and Kyle launched their assault on the supply wagons, setting fire to the crates of ammunition and food. The first explosion ripped through the camp, sending men scattering in all directions. Sam and Josiah struck next, charging into the heart of the camp, cutting down sentries and creating confusion. The vultures were disoriented, caught off guard by the sudden assault. "Go, go!" Sam shouted as he and Josiah moved deeper into the chaos, slashing through the camp. Razor's men were scrambling, trying to regroup, but it was too late. Then, through the smoke and gunfire, Sam saw him, the leader of the vultures. Razor himself, the man who had been the source of so much pain, so much suffering. He stood in the middle of the camp, his eyes narrowing as he took in the destruction. His lips curled into a smile. "You think this is going to stop me?" Razor called out, his voice cold and menacing. Sam's heart raced, but he didn't flinch. "You underestimated us," he shouted back, raising his rifle. The battle was far from over, but Sam knew one thing for certain. Steelridge had just thrown its first punch, and Razor would never forget it. The chaos of the camp had erupted into an inferno, but Sam could feel his focus sharpen as he pushed forward. Razor's men were scattered, running in all directions, trying to regroup amidst the confusion. The supply wagons burned fiercely, sending plumes of smoke into the sky, masking their movements and adding to the disarray. Sam and Josiah continued their assault, taking down several more vultures, cutting through their defenses with ruthless precision. The sound of gunfire echoed through the camp as the enemy scrambled to respond. "We've got this," Josiah shouted, his voice filled with adrenaline. He wiped the sweat from his brow as he fired a shot into a cluster of men trying to rally near a makeshift barricade. Sam nodded, but kept his gaze fixed ahead. In the distance, Razor's form was still visible, his tall figure standing at the center of the camp. He was surrounded by a handful of his top lieutenants, but there was something about his posture. He wasn't retreating. He was preparing for something bigger. "Keep pushing," Sam barked to Josiah. "We can't let him get away. He's the one we need." They moved toward Razor, cutting through the confusion like a storm. But as they drew nearer, Sam felt the air shift, a sense of foreboding creeping over him. It was too easy, too clean. This wasn't just a raid. It was a trap. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet, followed by the screech of engines. The sound of motorcycles roaring to life echoed through the camp, and Sam's blood ran cold. Razor had anticipated them. They hadn't come alone. "Ambush!" Josiah yelled, his voice sharp with realization. Sam spun around just as a dozen vultures burst from behind a series of overturned wagons, their bikes kicking up dirt as they revved forward. The roar of the engines was deafening, and before Sam could react, a few of them had already cut off their escape route. "We're surrounded," Josiah muttered, his gun aimed at one of the oncoming bikers. "This is what happens when you play in Razor's backyard." Sam gritted his teeth, heart racing. They couldn't afford to be cornered here, not with Steelridge's future hanging in the balance. They had to get out, but Razor was still out there, and he knew the man wouldn't give up easily. "Split up," Sam ordered, his voice ringing out over the chaos. "Take out as many as you can, but don't let them trap you. Regroup at the North Ridge." He turned to Josiah, his jaw set with determination. "We're taking Razor down." Josiah didn't need another word. They broke off from the main group, charging toward Razor's command center, where the remaining lieutenants were holed up. The bikes were closing in fast, but Sam kept his focus. He wasn't about to let Razor escape again. As they closed the distance, Sam's rifle barked, picking off two of the vultures in rapid succession. But the noise of their weapons only seemed to draw more attention. Razor's lieutenants began to fire back, their shots forcing Sam and Josiah to take cover behind a pile of debris. "We need to move fast, Sam," Josiah shouted, ducking behind a crate as bullets whizzed by. "Razor's not going to wait around much longer." "I know," Sam growled, scanning the camp. There were too many vultures, but Razor wasn't giving them any room to breathe. They had to finish what they started, or this was all for nothing. From the corner of his eye, Sam saw a figure sprinting toward them. Kyle, his face grim, running with the intensity of someone who had just realized the stakes. He barely slowed down as he reached Sam and Josiah, diving behind the debris for cover. "The bikes are coming in hot," Kyle panted. "We've got a minute, maybe two. If we don't finish Razor now, we're done for." Sam's mind raced. They needed a plan. Fast. "Follow my lead," Sam said, making a snap decision. "Kyle, take the north flank. Josiah, we push right. I'll take Razor." Without waiting for a reply, Sam moved, his feet pounding across the dusty ground as he sprinted toward Razor's position. The lieutenants fired at him, but Sam was too quick, zigzagging to avoid their shots. His heart hammered in his chest, but his mind was clear. This was the moment. As he neared Razor, the man turned, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Razor's cold, calculating eyes met Sam's. "You think you can take me down, old man?" Razor sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Steel Ridge is mine. You're just a footnote in my story." Sam's lip curled in a tight smile. "You've underestimated the wrong people." With a snap of his fingers, Razor's lieutenants opened fire. Sam dove behind a large rock, the bullets kicking up dust around him. He could hear the vultures' bikes closing in, their engines roaring like beasts of war. "Move now," Sam shouted, signaling to Josiah and Kyle. They were closing in, but it was a fight they could win if they kept their heads. Sam's mind raced, his instincts taking over. He emerged from his cover, moving with speed and precision, and fired at Razor's closest lieutenant. The man fell, and Razor's remaining guards hesitated for a split second, just long enough for Sam to press forward. This was it, the final showdown. The air crackled with tension as Sam lunged toward Razor, his boots pounding the earth beneath him. The remaining lieutenants scrambled, trying to reposition themselves to protect their leader, but Sam was like a force of nature, unstoppable, relentless. Razor's eyes flickered with a moment of hesitation. His smirk faded as he realized Sam wasn't retreating, wasn't backing down. "You don't get it, do you?" Razor spat, his voice full of venom. "I own this town. You're nothing but a shadow of a forgotten past." Sam's rifle was steady in his hands, his focus narrowing entirely on the vulture leader. The memories of everything he'd lost, everything that Steel Ridge had lost, flashed in his mind. His brothers, the town's future, the legacy of the old days. It all came rushing back. The roar of engines from the surrounding bikers grew louder, but Sam didn't flinch. He had one goal now, Razor. Razor raised his weapon, aiming for Sam's chest, but in that brief moment, his guard was down. Sam fired first. The shot rang out, sharp and clear, and Razor's arm jerked back as the bullet hit his shoulder. "Arg!" Razor's eyes flared with rage, his weapon momentarily dropping as he staggered back. His men hesitated, unsure whether to fall back or advance, but Sam's confidence surged. He pushed forward, keeping his focus on Razor. "You're done," Sam growled. "Steel Ridge is stronger than your gang will ever be." The moment Razor's gun dropped, Sam sprinted forward, his feet kicking up dirt as he closed the distance. One of Razor's lieutenants lunged at Sam, but Josiah appeared like a shadow behind him. In a swift motion, he drove his knife into the man's back, taking him down before the threat could escalate. Razor was desperate now. He reached for a backup knife strapped to his side, but Sam was too quick. He grabbed the arm holding the blade and twisted it violently, forcing Razor to drop it with a grunt. Sam's fist connected with Razor's jaw, knocking him off balance. "You made a mistake," Sam said, his voice low but steady. "Steel Ridge doesn't belong to you. It belongs to its people." Razor struggled, his eyes wild, but Sam wasn't letting go. With one last, powerful shove, Sam knocked Razor to the ground, standing over him. Razor glared up, his face contorted in pain and disbelief. No one's going to care about your little rebellion, Razor spat, his breath heavy. The vultures will burn this place to the ground, even if I'm not here to see it. Sam stood over him, unwavering. The sound of approaching bikes was louder now, but Sam wasn't listening to them. His mind was clear, his heart steady. He knew what had to be done. Steelridge isn't about what you want. It's about what we build together, Sam said, locking eyes with Razor. You and your gang will never have the power to destroy that. With one final move, Sam raised his hand, signaling Kyle and Josiah, who were closing in from the sides. They had formed a perimeter around the camp, keeping the remaining bikers at bay. The finality in the air was thick. Razor was beaten, and his gang had nowhere to run. Josiah stepped forward, wiping the blood from his knife, his face hard. It's over, Razor. Your reign ends today. Razor's breathing was shallow as he tried to push himself up, but Sam stepped on his chest, keeping him pinned to the ground. I'm giving you one chance to leave, Sam said, his voice calm but firm. If you walk, I don't care what you do after. If you stay, you won't leave here alive. Razor's eyes flickered between Sam's hard gaze and the faces of his former men, who were now surrendering, throwing down their weapons. His pride was broken, but his defiance remained. Go on, then, Razor sneered. Finish it. Sam's eyes narrowed, but he wasn't here to end a life unless necessary. He motioned to his men. Take him to the edge of town. If he wants to leave, fine. But if he ever sets foot in Steelridge again, we'll finish what we started. Razor's jaw clenched in anger as two of Sam's men grabbed him roughly, dragging him away from the battlefield. As the last of the bikers were rounded up and disarmed, Sam took a deep breath. The fight was over. Steelridge had been saved. Josiah came over, clapping him on the back. You did it, Sam. We did it. Sam nodded, exhaustion settling in, but the weight of victory felt good. He looked out at the burning wreckage of the vultures' camp, and the sight of Steelridge, the town he had vowed to protect, made everything worth it. They had won, and Steelridge had survived. As the smoke from the burning wreckage began to clear, Sam could see the first rays of the morning sun beginning to rise over the horizon. The town was still standing, and in that moment, Sam knew that as long as people like him and Josiah were around, Steelridge would always fight back, no matter the odds. They had turned the tide, and Steelridge was theirs to rebuild. The aftermath of the battle left the town in a state of uneasy quiet. The streets, once echoing with the sounds of chaos and violence, now felt almost eerie in their stillness. But that was about to change. Sam stood at the edge of the town, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sun had risen fully now, casting a warm glow over Steelridge. The town had endured another trial, and yet it stood, resilient and proud. A far cry from the days of tension and fear when the vultures had claimed control. He turned to Kyle and Josiah, who were standing nearby, each with the same sense of weary triumph in their eyes. There was still work to be done, still repairs to make, but for now, the victory felt sweet. The vultures were scattered, their leader taken out of the equation. Sam knew that the threat wasn't gone entirely, but today marked a decisive turning point. We can't let up, Kyle said, breaking the silence. There are still other gangs out there. They'll try to take advantage of this power vacuum. Sam nodded, his mind already shifting to the future. We'll keep watch. But this town has stood before, and it will again. The people of Steelridge are strong. Josiah, ever the realist, added, we'll need to rally the townsfolk. People have been living in fear for too long. It's time to remind them of what they're capable of, what they've always been capable of. Sam met Josiah's gaze, a knowing look passing between them. It wasn't just about keeping the peace now. It was about rebuilding the town, making it a place of hope again. For too long, Steelridge had been a shell of what it once was. They'd allowed themselves to be broken by the fear of outside forces, by the dominance of gangs like the vultures. But Sam knew better. The people here had survived tough times before, and they could do it again. We'll rebuild everything, brick by brick, town by town, Sam said firmly. But we'll rebuild it right. It's not just about the walls and streets. It's about trust. It's about community. As the morning wore on, Sam and his men began to organize the town's defense and rebuilding efforts. The first step was to ensure that the remaining vultures were taken far away from Steel Ridge, their future uncertain. Razor, despite his rage, was forced into exile, his gang scattered in every direction. Some members, disillusioned, had already begun to disappear into the wilderness, while others, who had been hesitant to follow Razor's more extreme tactics, surrendered willingly. By midday, people from all parts of Steel Ridge began to emerge, tentative at first, but slowly finding their courage as word spread that the battle was over. They began to gather in the town square, the very heart of their community. Sam knew that this was his moment, the moment to remind them of who they were, what they had lost, and most importantly, what they could still become. Sam stood before them, looking out over the crowd. He could see the remnants of fear in their eyes, but also the sparks of hope beginning to burn. They were scared, but they weren't broken. They had survived the worst. "We've fought to keep this town safe," Sam began, his voice strong and unwavering. "But it's not just me. It's all of us. Steel Ridge doesn't belong to gangs. It doesn't belong to outsiders who want to take what we've built. It belongs to the people who live here, to the families, the workers, the ones who've bled and sweat for this place." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "We've got a lot of work to do. There's rebuilding to be done, both in our streets and in our hearts. But we're not alone. We're a community, and together, we will make Steel Ridge stronger than it's ever been. We'll rebuild our town, our families, our lives. But this time, it will be on our terms." The crowd remained silent for a beat, and then, slowly, a few people began to clap. Then others joined in, and soon the applause spread, growing louder and louder. The people of Steel Ridge weren't just relieved. They were ready. Ready to work, ready to rebuild, and most of all, ready to reclaim their town. Later that evening, Sam sat on the porch of what was once the old sheriff's office. He'd taken up residence here, not because of nostalgia, but because it was the center of Steel Ridge's defense, the heart of the town's future. Josiah joined him, both men gazing out over the town they had fought to save. "You did good, Sam," Josiah said, his voice low but filled with respect. Sam didn't look away from the town's horizon. "We all did." Josiah grinned. "So, what now?" Sam exhaled deeply. "Now we make sure we're ready for whatever comes next. Steel Ridge isn't just a place. It's the people. And as long as they have the will to fight, we'll be here to defend them." The two men sat in silence for a moment longer, watching as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The night would come, and with it, more challenges. But tonight, Steel Ridge stood stronger than it had in years. And that was a victory worth celebrating. Sam stood up and looked over at Josiah. "Tomorrow, we start rebuilding. Not just the buildings, but everything. This town, the people, everything." Josiah nodded. "Let's get to work." And with that, they turned to the future, one step at a time, together. Steel Ridge had survived. Now, it was time to thrive. The days that followed were a blur of action, effort, and new beginnings. Steel Ridge, though battered, was not broken. Sam and the people of the town had begun the slow but steady process of rebuilding, from clearing debris to patching up homes, reinforcing walls, and repairing what had been torn down. There were no shortcuts. It was hard work, but it was honest, and everyone contributed in their own way. Sam's leadership became the anchor for the town. He moved between groups, offering advice, lending a hand, and reminding people of their shared strength. Even the skeptics, those who had been too afraid to hope, began to see that a change was coming. Steel Ridge was not just going to survive, it was going to flourish. One morning, while helping rebuild a section of the wall around the town, Sam was approached by Kyle, who was holding something in his hand. It was a crude map of Steel Ridge, drawn hastily on a piece of parchment. "I've been thinking," Kyle began, his voice steady but laced with concern. "The vultures might be gone, but there are other gangs out there. We can't just focus on rebuilding the town. We need to ensure it stays protected. We need a real defense plan." Sam nodded. He had already been considering this, but hearing it from Kyle made the reality of it more urgent. "You're right. We need to make sure this place stays safe, That what we've worked so hard for isn't destroyed in an instant. Exactly. I've been talking to the other folks. Some of the farmers, a few of the traders. Everyone's in, Sam. They want to protect their homes, their families. But they'll need training. They'll need leadership. Sam looked out over the fields and homes that stretched out beyond the town's walls. The work ahead of them seemed endless, but Kyle was right. The vultures had shown them just how fragile their safety was. All right, we'll train them. We'll build a proper defense. But we also need to focus on something else, trust. People have been living under the thumb of fear for too long. They need to believe in each other again. Kyle gave him a sideways glance. You mean like a town militia? More than that, Sam replied. I mean rebuilding Steel Ridge from the inside out. A real community effort, not just in defense, but in everything. We'll have to trust one another if we're going to make this work. It wasn't just about walls or weapons. It was about the people's hearts. The vultures had come because Steel Ridge had been weak, not physically, but emotionally. The people had been divided, suspicious, and beaten down by years of violence and loss. But now, Sam believed, they could be stronger than ever, not just in the strength of their arms but in the unity of their spirit. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Training sessions were set up, not just for defense but for cooperation. Sam, Josiah, and Kyle worked tirelessly, teaching everyone from the youngest children to the oldest residents how to defend themselves, how to work together, and most importantly, how to trust each other again. Josiah, with his natural leadership, took charge of organizing work crews to rebuild homes and structures. His tough exterior softened when working alongside families, especially those who had lost loved ones during the vultures' reign of terror. He found solace in their resilience, seeing in their faces the same fight he'd once had when he first came to Steel Ridge all those years ago. As Steel Ridge began to take shape again, so did its community. People worked side by side, sharing meals, stories, and laughter in the town square. Every evening, they gathered for town meetings where they discussed the future, made decisions together, and reaffirmed their commitment to each other. Sam stood at the center of these meetings, not as a leader who dictated terms, but as one among them, reminding everyone that this town belonged to all of them. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, a large group of travelers came into town. They were weary, their clothes worn, and their eyes tired. But there was something else about them, something desperate. Sam met them at the edge of the gates, along with Kyle and Josiah. The travelers explained that they had been on the road for days, fleeing from a new gang that had taken over their town to the east. They had heard about Steel Ridge's victory over the vultures and hoped it was a sign of safety. Please, the leader of the group, a woman named Nora, pleaded. We've lost everything. Our homes, our families, we're just trying to survive. We need a place to stay. Sam looked at Josiah and Kyle, who both gave him a silent nod. The weight of their decisions was heavy, but Sam knew that Steel Ridge had once been a place of refuge. It could be again. You're welcome here, Sam said, his voice firm but kind. Steel Ridge is a place for those who need help, but we won't turn anyone away. You'll find work here, and you'll find protection. But we don't just take, we give too. If you're going to stay, you'll need to contribute, to rebuild, to make this town stronger. Nora nodded gratefully. We'll do whatever it takes. Sam smiled, knowing that this was the true strength of Steel Ridge. It wasn't just about defending against outsiders. It was about creating a community that was open, strong, and capable of surviving whatever the world threw at them. They weren't just rebuilding homes and walls. They were rebuilding trust, humanity, and hope. The days turned into weeks, and the town of Steel Ridge continued to grow, stronger than ever before. Sam, Kyle, Josiah, and the rest of the town had created something beautiful. Not just a fortified town, but a true community, united in their shared vision for the future. The gangs that had once preyed on Steel Ridge would always be a threat in the shadows. But for now, the people of Steel Ridge were ready. They were no longer afraid. They knew they had something worth fighting for, something more powerful than any gang. Each other. And with that unity, Steel Ridge stood proud. A beacon of hope in a world that had forgotten what it meant to stand together. The road ahead was long, but they would walk it, side by side, every step of the way. As Steel Ridge continued to rebuild, word of its transformation spread. The townspeople had become more than just survivors. They were now a symbol of resilience. Yet, the threat of violence had not fully passed. Outside the walls of Steel Ridge, trouble was brewing. The land beyond was still fraught with the remnants of lawlessness, and other gangs, hungry for power, had begun to take notice of the town's success. Sam knew that the work they had done was fragile. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything they had worked for could come crashing down. The sense of urgency never left him. One night, as the town settled under a blanket of stars, Sam sat with Kyle and Josiah around a fire. The crackle of burning wood punctuated the otherwise quiet evening, but the weight of what was to come hung heavily in the air. "I've been hearing rumors," Kyle said quietly, staring into the flames. "A new gang is moving through the region. They're calling themselves the Red Falcons. They've been taking down settlements like ours, wiping out whole towns. No one's safe." Sam's eyes narrowed. "Have you heard anything specific about them? Numbers? Weapons?" Kyle shook his head. "Not much, but they're known for their brutality. They leave nothing behind. People either join them or they're left to die." Sam stood up, his thoughts racing. He couldn't ignore the threat, but he also couldn't make any rash decisions. They had to be smart, careful. Steel Ridge was still fragile. He'd need to gather more information to make sure they were prepared. "We'll start by securing the perimeter," Sam said, his voice resolute. "Kyle, get in touch with our allies. Anyone we can trust. We need to form a coalition. Josiah, I need you to work with the builders. If we're going to defend this town, we need stronger walls, better watchtowers. Let's be ready for anything." Josiah nodded, already planning what needed to be done. "We'll get to work, Sam. You can count on us." But Sam wasn't sure whether they could count on themselves. Steel Ridge had grown too fast, too strong, too quickly. And while that strength gave him hope, it also gave him doubts. Were they ready to face a threat like the Red Falcons? The next few days were a flurry of activity. Everyone pitched in, reinforcing the town's defenses, building higher walls, fortifying entry points, and training harder. The people who had once been farmers, traders, and homemakers now stood side by side, learning how to use weapons, how to fight, and how to protect their families. It was a hard, grueling process, but Sam saw something in their eyes, a fire, a determination that hadn't been there when he first arrived. Despite their preparations, Sam could not shake the feeling that something was coming. It was an unsettling sensation, like the calm before a storm. He spent hours at the perimeter, watching the horizon, listening to the sounds of the land outside the gates. Then, one morning, as the sun barely kissed the earth, a scout arrived at the gates with urgent news. The Red Falcons had been spotted not far from Steel Ridge. "They're coming," the scout said, breathless and wide-eyed. "We saw them. At least 30 of them. On horseback. They're moving fast. They'll be here by nightfall." Sam felt his heart skip a beat. 30. That was a small enough number to fend off, but the Red Falcons had a reputation. Their strength wasn't just in numbers. It was in their cruelty, in their ability to make people bend to their will. He turned to Kyle and Josiah, who were standing by, ready for orders. "We have to prepare, and we need to do it now," Sam said. "Get everyone to the gates. I want to organize patrols around the town. Kyle, I need you to stay with the fighters. Josiah, you're with me on the walls." The preparations moved at a rapid pace. Steel Ridge's people, hardened by the years of suffering and the aftermath of the vultures, were no strangers to adversity. They moved with a sense of purpose, taking up positions, ready to face whatever came their way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town, the first riders of the Red Falcons appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the setting sun. The unmistakable sound of hooves reverberated through the still air. Sam's grip tightened around the hilt of his sword. He stood at the top of one of the newly built watchtowers, his eyes trained on the approaching figures. He could feel his heart beat in his chest, steady and sure. "They're here," Kyle's voice came through the darkening air. Sam looked at him and nodded. "Let's make sure they know what Steel Ridge is made of." As the Red Falcons drew closer, the gates of Steel Ridge closed with a heavy, echoing thud. The people of Steel Ridge had fought hard for their survival, and now they would fight to keep it. Sam stood tall, leading his people into the unknown, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The Red Falcons were known for their brutality, but Steel Ridge had something they didn't: hope, unity, and the will to defend their home. The battle for Steel Ridge was about to begin. The air grew heavy as the Red Falcons approached the town. The distant sound of hooves grew louder, vibrating through the ground like the rumble of a storm. Sam stood firm at the top of the watchtower, his eyes scanning the horizon, waiting for the first signs of the enemy. "Everyone ready?" he called down to the soldiers below, his voice calm but urgent. Kyle, standing near the barricades, gave him a thumbs up. "We're ready. The walls are reinforced, the watchtowers are manned, and every man and woman has their weapon." Josiah emerged from the shadows of the town's interior, his face grim but determined. "We've got them lined up, Sam. The town's defenses are solid. Just keep your head cool." The tension in the air was palpable. Steel Ridge had never faced a threat like this, and no one could be certain how the town would hold up under the pressure. But there was no turning back now. They'd made their choice, and they would fight to protect the home they had built from the ground up. As the first Red Falcons appeared on the outskirts of Steel Ridge, the town's gates groaned under the strain of holding back an enemy that wasn't just after power, but after destruction. The Red Falcons were known for their ruthless ways: raiders, killers, and conquerors. They wanted Steel Ridge for their own, and Sam knew they wouldn't be satisfied with anything less than complete domination. The riders were menacing, their faces covered by masks and helmets, their horses as dark as the night. Each of them wore crimson insignia on their armor, marking them unmistakably as part of the Red Falcons. The air seemed to grow colder as they approached, their presence like a shadow creeping over the land. The town was silent. The people, hidden behind the defenses, held their breath. It wasn't just the Red Falcons who feared what was coming. Sam felt the weight of it on his shoulders. His hand gripped his sword, the hilt slick with anticipation. He glanced at the town's fighters: old men, young women, farmers turned soldiers, and his heart swelled with pride. They were ready. Then, the first shout rang out from the Red Falcons, carried by the wind like an omen. It was a challenge, a warning. The leader of the group, a tall man draped in a crimson cloak, raised his arm high, signaling to his riders. They reined in their horses, forming a loose circle around the town. "I am Vornak, leader of the Red Falcons," the man bellowed. His voice was deep, commanding, like a thunderclap. "We've come for Steel Ridge. Surrender now, and we may spare your lives. Defy us, and you'll be nothing but ashes." A hush fell over Steel Ridge. Sam could feel the tension mount. This was the moment. The entire town was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. He stepped forward, his figure visible atop the watchtower. His voice rang out, loud and clear, with unwavering confidence. "Steel Ridge does not surrender to anyone," he called back. "We've fought for this town. We've bled for it, and we will die for it before we let you take it from us." Vornak's laughter echoed across the battlefield, cold and menacing. "So be it. Your blood will stain these walls, and your bones will be added to the ground. We will take what we want, whether you stand in our way or not." A tense silence followed as the two sides locked eyes across the distance. The Red Falcons were ready for battle, their weapons gleaming in the dying light of the day. Sam could feel the weight of his people's hopes pressing down on him. He couldn't afford to falter now. "We've built this town together," Sam said to those around him, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "And we will protect it together. When they come, we fight as one." The soldiers nodded, their faces set with determination. Sam gave a quick hand signal, and the first volley of arrows shot out from the walls, whistling through the air like a storm of iron. The Red Falcons flinched but didn't back down. They charged forward, their horses galloping toward the gates, the sound of hooves thundering like war drums. It was now or never. The battle erupted in a flurry of motion. The gates of Steel Ridge slammed open, and the first wave of Red Falcons rushed forward, weapons drawn. The people of Steel Ridge met them head-on, defending their home with the ferocity of cornered animals. Sam fought alongside his people, his sword cutting through the chaos. He could hear the clash of steel, the cries of the fallen, and the thundering of hooves. The town was alive with the sounds of battle. But Sam knew this wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for the future of Steel Ridge. The Red Falcons might have had the numbers, but Steel Ridge had something they couldn't take: unity. The people fought with everything they had, from the oldest to the youngest, standing side by side. As the Red Falcons pushed forward, Sam led the charge, cutting a path through their ranks. He could see Vornak at the center of the enemy line, directing the chaos with cold precision. Sam's eyes narrowed. He knew if they were going to win this, they had to take down their leader. With a fierce yell, Sam broke through the line, charging toward Vornak. The two locked eyes as Sam closed the distance. Vornak swung his blade with deadly intent, but Sam was faster, ducking under the strike and delivering a blow to Vornak's side. The battle raged on around them, but Sam's focus was singular, taking down the leader of the Red Falcons. Vornak staggered but quickly regained his footing, his eyes burning with rage. "You think you can stop me?" Vornak growled. "I don't think," Sam replied. "I know." With a final, swift strike, Sam drove his sword through Vornak's chest, the blade sinking deep. The Red Falcon's leader collapsed, his body falling limp to the ground. The sight of their fallen leader struck a blow to the morale of the Red Falcons. Their charge faltered, their ranks breaking as doubt spread among them. Steel Ridge's fighters pressed forward, emboldened by their victory. By the time the moon rose high in the sky, the battle was over. The Red Falcons had been repelled, their forces broken. Steel Ridge had held its ground. Sam stood over the fallen leader of the Red Falcons, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his sword slick with blood. The town was safe, for now, but Sam knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be threats. But tonight, Steel Ridge had proven that it was not a place to be taken lightly. It was their home, and they would fight to the death to protect it. The dawn after the battle came quietly, as if the world itself needed time to recover. The morning sun rose over Steel Ridge, casting a golden light on the debris-strewn streets and the remnants of the night's conflict. The air was still, heavy with the scent of smoke and earth. But there was no mistaking the sense of relief that hung over the town. Sam stood at the edge of the town square, watching as his people began the slow process of rebuilding. The wounded were being tended to, bodies of the fallen were being moved, and those who could still fight were gathering what little they had left. Steel Ridge had taken heavy losses, but they had held their ground. His mind kept returning to the battle, the roar of the Red Falcons, the sound of steel on steel, the clash of hooves. But most of all, he thought of Vornak, the leader of the invaders. The moment when Sam had struck him down, he had felt something shift in the air, something that went beyond victory. It was as if the entire town had breathed a collective sigh of relief, their unity a shield that no enemy could break. Kyle approached from behind, his face covered in grime but his eyes bright with pride. "You did it, Sam." "We did it," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. Sam nodded, still staring out over the town. "We did it together." Josiah joined them, his expression grim as he surveyed the battlefield. "The town's lost a lot of good people," he said softly, "but we're alive. We fought them off. Steel Ridge's still standing." "That's all that matters," Sam replied. "We'll rebuild. We always do." But even as they spoke, Sam could feel the weight of the battle pressing on him. The people of Steel Ridge had won this fight, but the Red Falcons would not be gone forever. The bloodshed had left a mark on the town, but it had also made them stronger. The unity they had shown in the face of death, the determination that had burned in every heart, would stay with them. "I want a scout team out in the field, checking for any remnants of the Falcons," Sam said, turning to Josiah. "We can't afford to be caught off guard again." Josiah nodded, already formulating a plan. "I'll get the team together. We'll make sure nothing's left." As Josiah left to gather the scouts, Kyle turned to Sam, his voice quiet. "What now? Do we prepare for more attacks?" Sam shook his head, finally turning to face his friend. "Not yet. For now, we rebuild. We mourn our dead, honor their sacrifices, and make sure this town stays standing. But we'll keep our eyes open. The Falcons may retreat, but they won't forget us." "Do you think they'll come back?" Kyle asked. Sam looked out over the town again, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. They'll come back eventually, but this time, we'll be ready. As the days passed, life in Steel Ridge began to return to some semblance of normal. The town was scarred, its walls bearing the marks of the Red Falcons' assault, the streets littered with the remains of a battle that had left its mark. But the people of Steel Ridge were resilient. Every day, they worked together to rebuild their homes, their lives, and their spirits. Sam found himself often walking the streets, visiting the wounded, offering encouragement. The townspeople had looked to him for leadership during the battle, and now they looked to him for guidance in the aftermath. At night, when the work slowed and the town settled into an uneasy peace, Sam would sit by the fire, his thoughts heavy. He knew that the Red Falcons were not a fleeting threat. They would return, and when they did, Steel Ridge would need to be ready. But Sam wasn't just worried about the external threat anymore. He was worried about the internal cracks that might appear when the dust settled. No one could say how long Steel Ridge's fragile peace would last. But Sam knew one thing for sure. They would face whatever came next with the same resolve that had driven them to victory. A week later, a small group of survivors from the Red Falcons arrived at the edge of Steel Ridge. They were ragged, their horses weary from the retreat, their faces marked by defeat. Sam stood atop the town's watchtower, watching them approach. As they reached the gates, Sam ordered the gates opened but kept a watchful eye on them. He wasn't sure what they wanted, whether they sought revenge or a chance to flee. But the fact that they had survived meant they knew something about the Falcons that could be valuable. The group was led by a younger man, no older than 20, his face marked with dirt and fear. He dismounted from his horse, his eyes wide as he approached Sam. "We need to talk," the young man said, his voice shaky. "Vornak, he's dead, and the Falcons, they're splintering. We need help." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Help? After what you did to us?" The young man nodded, swallowing hard. "We don't have a choice. The Red Falcons were never what they seemed. It wasn't about honor or war. It was about power, and now it's falling apart. The leader's dead, and the rest of us are stranded. We've got no food, no shelter, and no protection. We need a place to regroup, or at least a chance to live." Sam studied the man for a long moment, weighing his options. He could refuse, push them out, but that would only lead to more bloodshed. Or he could give them a chance, offer mercy, and try to use the situation to gather more information. "What's your name?" Sam asked. "Yarek," the young man replied, his voice steadying as he realized Sam wasn't immediately rejecting him. Sam nodded. "We'll give you food, shelter for now, but you'll work for it. If you betray us, I'll make sure you regret it. But for now, stay. There's no place for enemies here, but there is room for survival." Jarek's face softened, relief flooding his features. "Thank you. We'll earn our place here." As the gates closed behind the survivors, Sam stood still, deep in thought. The world outside Steel Ridge was changing, and the battle for survival was far from over. But for now, Steel Ridge would stand, unbroken, united, and ever watchful. And Sam knew, in his heart, that no matter what came next, they would face it together.